Assalamu alaikum. Today we are looking into the Minute on Indian Education by Thomas Babington Macaulay and Marcia from Islam Women's Arts and Science College, Waniambari. Now, this is a very crucial document in the formation of the Indian education system. It was charted around 1835, in February of 1835, by this Mr. Macaulay, who was a British historian and a Whig politician. He was a great essayist, rhetorician. He is known mainly for his historical, socio-political subject writings. He lived around 1800 to 1859. Personally speaking, he was an extremely brash, prejudiced, and highly biased individual. His take on Indian education, on Indian learning and Oriental learning, not merely Indian, as in like Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, everything is highly prejudiced, highly biased. To understand the document in question, we need to look into the Charter Act of 1813, which compelled the English East India Company to reallocate around 1 lakh rupees each year to be set apart for the revival and improvement of literature and encouragement of the learned natives India. Learned natives, mind you, it's a very specific term we will look into later on in this lecture. Now, so as a result, from 1813 to 1857, the company opened many schools and colleges under this charter, but it was very vague in terms of how this money would be spent. It did not specify who would be benefited the most, and what kind of education to be imparted, and what education would be most beneficial to the classes. So various committees were set for looking into the matter and deciding upon these questions, to work on these questions. So Macaulay was not the only individual, not the only officer of the East India Company who was assigned this responsibility. There were plenty of others. So each presented their view, and thereby the 1835 resolution came into being. And this is this infamous document that brought English to Indian education system. That supposedly brought English to Indian education system, and Macaulay was the president of that time. Then president of the General Committee of Public Education, and well, right or wrong, he is still considered as the architect of the system of education in India, because there was no systemized organization for native education. The English Education Act of 1835 was a legislative act of the Council of India passed by Lord William Bentinck, the Governor General of British India, to reallocate funds the East India Company was required by the British Parliament. See, required as in they were compelled. They did not do it willingly, albeit the responsibility fell on them and they had to work on it. Now, this 1835 Indian English Education Act was the result of the various memorandums, one of which was presented by Thomas Babington Macaulay. You need to keep this in mind. He was not the sole individual looking into it. But this memorandum became famous for his scathing comments on the inferiority of native culture in learning. The act itself, however, took a less negative attitude to the traditional education and was soon succeeded by further measures based upon the provision of adequate funding for both approaches. So, both the vernacular language education continued beside the English education, but the vernacular language education received little funding. It wasn't as if that they got much support from the government before that, but later on it was really specified after this minute. It was really specified that no further new grants would be or stipends would be allotted to the scholars of native language learning. See, for Macaulay, the world was pure black and white. It's either or black or white. So it's either civilized nations or barbarians. And to him, Britain represented the highest point of civilization. Obviously, the other one end would be the Indians. Was Macaulay ill informed by his own admission? See, he had this great, disregard or disdain for uh, Indian and Oriental learning, as Sanskrit and Persian. But what did he base his understanding on? He himself says, I have no knowledge of either Sanskrit or Arabic, but he seems to have spoken to people who have proficiency in Eastern tongues. And he says, I have never found one among them who could deny that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. See, here it also needs to be noted that Macaulay seems to revel in hyperboles. A single shelf of good European library worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. For someone who did not have any knowledge of either Sanskrit or Arabic, don't you think it a bit much? Either way, he made a few recommendations. I mean, he there were about 32 points in his memorandum, 32 minutes in his memorandum, but this could be summed up as his recommendations. He encouraged the promotion of European literature. He wanted European literature to be brought to India. He wanted all the native colleges and schools to be abolished. He wanted to stop the financial help given to scholars of the native schools, all the stipends and the grants that need to be stopped. And he wanted to make English as a medium of education. And besides, he also wanted the stopping of the printing of Arabic and Sanskrit books by the English East India Company, because to him the blank pages were worthier than in printed books of Arabic or Sanskrit. It's like he considered them trash. What did Macaulay criticize about India? You could rather ask what he did not criticize. He criticized Indian astronomy, Indian culture, Indian history, philosophy, religion, languages, lifestyle. Everything to him represented barbarism. He considered everything the Indians did or went of uncivilized and crude. And he advocated the national system of education for Indians mainly to serve the British concerns. So, unless the Indians knew the official language, they wouldn't be able to serve their masters well, the rulers well. That was one of his concerns. Okay. The main points of controversy from the Charter Act to the Memorandum and the 1835 English Education Act, these were the main points of controversy. The first was the aim of education of the British policy: to educate the classes in higher branches of learning or to educate the masses in elementary. See, the classes versus masses, as in few people being given higher education or the entire mass with the elementary education. This was one of the concerns: how to divide the funds. The type of knowledge, what kind of knowledge to be given, to promote Oriental learning or to introduce Western education. Medium of instruction, whether English or Persian and Sanskrit in Bengal, and English or Indian languages in Bombay and Madras. So it was always English or the native languages, Persian and Sanskrit, Indian languages, against English. Agency of education, whether the government should assume direct responsibility or indigenous systems, that is, the existing madrasas and pathshalas, should be given the responsibility of continuing the education systematized by the English East India Company. That was one of their concerns. The missionaries, it's because, see, before the establishment of the education system per se, the missionaries came from all over the world here into all those other countries that were colonized. And these missionaries, apart from teaching the English, apart from teaching the Word of God, they also were responsible for preaching and teaching languages and literature and sciences and whatnot. And this was acting against their interest. So they wanted to really look into whether to curtail the inflow of missionaries from everywhere and just allow the British missionaries alone, or to let everyone come in. So that was another one of their concerns. See, Macaulay, at one point, he says, I would at once stop the printing of Arabic and Sanskrit books. I would abolish the madrasa and the Sanskrit colleges at Calcutta. If the Benares and Delhi colleges should be retained, I would at least recommend that no stipends shall be given to any student who may hereafter repair thither, but that the people shall be left to make their own choice between the rival systems of education without being bribed by us to learn what they have no desire to know. See, isn't it really cunning use of the system wherein the stipends were given to scholars of Arabic madrasas and Sanskrit pathshalas? Says, you know, he makes it to look as if the students had no willingness to learn anything whatsoever of the of Arabic or Oriental learning as such, or Oriental or Indian learning as such, and they were being bribed to learn. So these stipends were considered as bribes, and the education they were getting in turn as forced upon them. Now, in his minute, he asserts it is, I believe, no exaggeration to say that all the historical information which has been collected from all the books written in the Sanskrit language is less valuable than what may be found in the most paltry abridgment used at preparatory schools in England. Again, a work of hyperbole. Now, there's this one, a downward filtration system. This is pretty interesting because what he, another focal point would be, of course, he believed that the Western learning was superior and currently could only be taught through the medium of English. So there is a need to produce by English language higher education. A class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect, who could in their turn develop the tools to transmit Western learning in the vernacular languages of India. So he wanted people looking like Indians but having tastes and opinions that of English. And they could turn and develop the tools to transmit Western learning in the vernacular languages of India. The Western learning could be turned into vernacular languages, and the masses could be benefited by it or learn the Western languages or Western literature through them. What were his arguments in favor of English language? First of all, well, this you have to agree with. It is a key to modern language and therefore more useful than Sanskrit or Arabic. Well, we stand corrected here, of course. Of all the colonizers from the West in India, English stands dominant. We need to agree with that as well. He believed that language of commerce throughout the seas of India of East would be English. Well, what he predicted came to be true. It will bring about, he said, it will bring about Renaissance in India just as Greek and Athens in England. This, again, we cannot really be decisive about the statement. And this point, look at this one crucial point here. He believes natives themselves wish to learn English instead of Arabic or Sanskrit. I don't know how far that is true, or whether it is acceptable at all or not. Again, he says it is not possible to educate a body of people, but it was possible through English education to bring about a class of persons, Indian, and this we have already discussed. That is, in the people who look like Indians but have the tastes and opinions and morals and intellect of the English. The merits of the system, first of all, the system organized the national system of education. Then the system fulfilled most of the objectives it planned, but well, it failed in some points, but we'll look into it later. The English schools were established, plenty of English schools were established, English became the medium of instruction, Western arts and science became popular, filtration theory of education emerged. So, these were some of the merits brought about by the system. When you look at the demerits, first, Indian culture and philosophy receded to the background. So, since English became the foundation language for every Indian, the Indian culture and philosophy it receded, and a very chosen few began to be to take any major interest in it. But no, vernacular languages began to be neglected, and Western culture was revered and age-old practices questioned. Arabic maktabs and Sanskrit pathshalas gradually ceased to receive funding. They weren't getting any funds as it is. Before that, the government did allow some stipends for the students, but otherwise weren't really receiving any great funds. The printing of Arabic and Sanskrit books was stopped. So, see, you also need to remember it was not stopped completely as such, but the Arabic and Sanskrit books were not being supported by the government. The publication of these books were not supported by the government. The company decided to discontinue support to traditional education beyond the Sanskrit College at Benares and the Mohammedan College. These were the two exceptions I spoke about earlier. The Sanskrit College at Benares and the Mohammedan College at Delhi. These were the traditional learning institutions that were, chosen by the East India Company to be maintained through the system. Now, the adaptation of downward filtration theory would be had its own agenda. The Britishers had their own agenda with this. The British rulers needed various types of employees for their administrative purposes. So the British government did not have sufficient funds to educate the masses. It could not possibly use the 1 lakh rupees to educate the entire India. So what they decided was to educate the upper crust. The upper class could be educated on British lines through English medium and would get higher posts in government services. And of course, they would naturally use this influence to control the masses from revolting against their rule. A divisionary tactic, and it worked in their favor, if you say so. The higher classes adapting English ways influenced the lower classes, and after educating the classes, the responsibility of educating the masses were left to the higher classes. So the masses became the responsibility of the classes. Now, who exactly is a learned native? We spoke about learned native earlier. The Parliament decided that learned native of the India would be the company's responsibility. So, Macaulay's idea of a learned native was a native familiar with the poetry of Milton and metaphysics of Locke and the physics of Newton. That is, an Indian only in external features but for all intellectual and practical purposes steeped in Western and English philosophy. Now, a main point to ponder, whether Macaulay laid the foundation for a great education system or crumbled the very foundations of our cultural identity has been a point of contention among historians, academicians, educational scholars for over a decade now. But before we laud or condemn him, we need only to consider the question he asks at the outset of his minute. We have a fund to be employed. In his minute, point 7, he says, we have a fund to be employed as government shall direct for the intellectual improvement of the people of this country. The simple question is, what is the most useful way of employing it? And of course, to him, using the money to teach Arabic, Persian, or a Sanskrit was waste of their money. Considering this opinion, whatever disdain or disparaging comments he uses would be, I could not say justified, but in his eyes, in his viewpoint, it would redeem him to some extent. He uses plenty of rhetoric to validate his claim, especially on the matter of the stipends received by the students of the native subjects or languages and the corresponding amount of money paid by the students to learn Western subjects. See, kind of unfair in his eyes. He says, see, why should one student be compelled to pay to learn Western subjects and another set of a bunch of students be paid in turn to learn Oriental languages, which are worthless. According to him, they are worthless. Says the children who learn the letters and a little elementary arithmetic from the village schoolmaster are not paid by him. He is paid for teaching them. Then why is it necessary to pay people to learn Sanskrit and Arabic? Evidently, because uh, uh, he says it is universally felt that the Sanskrit and Arabic are languages, the knowledge of which does not compensate for the trouble of acquiring them. On all such subjects, the state of the market is the detective state test. The state of the market, as in the demands of the market. The market demands that they learn Western learning because you pay for it. Only when you pay for something, it has some worth. If you are being paid to take something, you're not willingly taking it. That's his rhetoric, that's his claim he makes against the Oriental learning. Another interesting point we come across in minute number 30, in Minute on Indian Education, is Macaulay's vision for Indian legal system. See, he speaks about the Hindu law and the Mohammedan law learned from Sanskrit and Arabic books, and he says that the Parliament, there is the British Parliament, has commanded them to ascertain and digest the laws of India, and the assistance of a law commission has been given to them for that purpose. But as soon as the code is promulgated, the Shastras and the Hidayah will be useless to a Munsif or a Sadr Amin. As in, the Indian Code of Justice would be null and void if the Law Commission proposes or brings about English law here. So he says, I hope and trust that before the boys who are now entering at the Madrasa and the Sanskrit College have completed their studies, this great work will be finished. It would be manifestly absurd to educate the rising generation with a view to a state of things which we mean to alter before they reach manhood. See, what he means by this particular statement is that if the students, if the young boys are going to learn Hindu law and the Mohammedan law, or Muslim law, you could say, Sharia, it would be useless to them if this law commission comes into full-fledged working mode. So what would be the point in teaching them something that is not going to be useful to them later on? Now, Macaulay concludes with an ultimatum. He gives an ultimatum. He says that I am naturally, continuing with his disparaging comments on native subjects, he says, I am naturally desirous to decline all share in the responsibility of a body, which unless it alters its whole mode of proceedings, I must consider not merely as useless, but as positively noxious. See, to him, everything is absurd. Giving artificial encouragement to absurd theory, absurd metaphysics, absurd physics, absurd theology, for raising up a breed of scholars who find their scholarship an encumbrance and blemish, who live on the public while they are receiving their education, and whose education is so utterly useless to them that when they have received it, they must either starve or live on the public all the rest of their lives. And entertaining these opinions, he says that if the committee does not agree to his viewpoints, he does not want to share in the responsibility of bringing about this change in the Indian education system. Now, what was the impact of the minutes? First of all, Lord Bentinck immediately assented to Macaulay's minutes. He did, but no immediate action was taken. And see, Bentinck had already faced a lot of condemnation and dismissal from the post of governorship of Madras for his insensitivity to Indian religion and customs. So he did not immediately take any action. However, the new policy designed by the Calcutta Council reached the London offices only in 1836, and by 1841 this whole controversy was laid to rest. But it took another 13 years for the British to bring about a definitive statement of language policy to India through Wood's dispatch. Of course, no school or college of native learning suffered any closures, and although the resolution stipulated that no further stipends be awarded to Oriental studies, the native scholars already in receipt of government grants continued to receive their allowances. As Rosalie commented, Bentinck let Macaulay fire the rhetorical big guns while ensuring that vested interests suffered little actual damage. So, despite this minute not being that effective initially, it basically is important for laying the foundation for building up later reforms and later resolutions, bringing about later reformations in bringing about a structured kind of education system. Thank you.